Years later, even after he'd become a father himself, Isaac still had nightmares about it. Sometimes when he was awakened by a noise at night, he would lie in his tent, and it was as if he was back there, back on that night when he was merely a child, and he heard his father's voice from a nearby tent. It had been the darkest time of the night when Isaac heard Abraham cry out, "Here I am!" followed by the strangest discourse. It was as if Abraham was having a conversation, but Isaac was only hearing one side of it, as his father said things in response to unheard words. "Which son do you mean?" Abraham asked. "I have two." "What do you mean, my only son?" "I said there are two." "Isaac? What do you want with Isaac?" "I mean, yes, I do love Isaac, but I love Ishmael too." And then after a longer pause, Isaac could hear the cold fear and the dread in his father's voice as he said, "Yes, Lord, Moriah, we will go if you show us the way." Isaac hadn't known what any of it meant at the time, but it certainly did not seem good. And every time he remembered it afterwards, or even if someone just spoke in a tone that reminded him of how his father spoke on that night, he would begin to tremble. And sometimes it made him physically ill. And even now, even though he was a strong patriarch, respected in his community, the memory of it made him feel powerless, as if he were a small child all over again. The next morning, Abraham rose early, and he saddled a donkey, taking with him 2 servants. And then he called Isaac over to join the group. Isaac didn't want to come. He was filled with an unaccountable dread, but he was in no position to refuse. When the group set out, Isaac noticed that his father wouldn't look at him, wouldn't even meet his eyes whenever he glanced his way. And he offered no explanation of where they were going or why. After they had walked a short way, they came upon a fallen tree, and Abraham stopped and split pieces of wood with his axe. Then he fastened the wood onto the back of the donkey. The wood, together with the pot of smoldering fire carried by one of the boys, and the ceremonial stone knife at his father's belt, led Isaac to assume that the purpose of this journey was to perform a sacrifice. He had many questions, but he could not dare to speak them. The group traveled for 3 days before Isaac finally looked up and saw a mountain looming in the distance. It was at this point that Abraham told the 2 boys to stay with the donkey and that he and Isaac would go on alone. He took the wood from the donkey's back and tied it to Isaac's before taking the pot of fire himself, the pot that had been carefully fed all this time so as not to go out. And so it was that father and son moved on together. Once the servant boys had fallen into the distance and the 2 of them were alone, Isaac finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind for 3 days. "Father," he said, "here I am, my son. Abraham replied. And of course, that phrase took Isaac right back to what he had heard his father say in the tent a few nights previous. He had a deep, deep feeling that something was very wrong. But he still felt as if he needed an answer to his question, and so he pointed to the fire pot. The fire is here, he said. And so is the wood, he added, pointing to the load on his back. At this point, his gaze paused for a moment on the handle to the blade that protruded from his father's waist, but something prevented him from mentioning that. Probably the same thing that ever since had made him shudder whenever he caught sight of such a ceremonial blade. But at this point, the pause had gone on too long, and Abraham automatically looked at his son. For a few agonizing seconds, their gazes met, and Isaac managed to stammer out, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham looked away, and when he spoke, it was as if he were speaking to someone else, someone not present. "God's self will see to the lamb for the burnt offering, my son," he said. "Don't you worry about that." Isaac had done his best to never remember what had happened once they arrived at the top of that mountain. Whenever his conscious mind would drift in the general direction of such events, he forced himself to think of something else. But it never quite worked. The memory kept coming back, often when he least expected it, often triggered by the oddest thing. And he would find himself flying off the handle. It happened especially with his son Jacob, often for the least of offense. Jacob looked so much like his grandfather. And how often had Isaac become unaccountably enraged with Rebekah, who had only been kind to him. Sometimes these days she treated him more as an adversary than a husband. And he knew. He knew it was because no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't let go of what happened on that damned mountain. It made him angry. And she bore the brunt of it, more often than not. Once they had reached the top of the mountain, Isaac watched warily as Abraham took stones and built a makeshift altar. He took the wood and carefully laid it out, and then he turned to his son. Isaac had successfully managed to block out the next few seconds from his memory. It only came back in his nightmares. And so what he recalled when he dared to think on it was that he suddenly found himself lying on the altar, his legs and his arms trussed together, like you might do to an animal sacrifice. And he saw his father holding the knife to his throat, with a wild look in his eyes. And then Abraham's face changed. It went blank for a moment. And then he uttered for the third time the same words that had haunted Isaac ever since. "Here I am." And then Isaac heard something too. The sound of wrestling in a nearby bush. Abraham dropped the knife and he ran to the spot. And he yelped with pleasure and surprise as he pulled back the undergrowth to reveal a ram, a young ram struggling there, caught by its horns. You see, Isaac, he cried. I was right. God did see to it. Yahweh is the one who sees my need. Abraham was long dead. And never, not once before he passed, had he spoken to Isaac about what had happened on that day. Perhaps that's why Isaac never felt as if anything was resolved. And it was as if a horrible doom still hung over him. And now that his own children were grown, he had never been able to talk about it. Not to them, not to anybody. And sometimes he couldn't help but feel that that was why why Esau was so wild. And that was why it seemed as if he had driven Jacob away. I guess that's how it goes. Perhaps that's what they mean when they say that the sins of the fathers are passed down to the sons. Despite everything, though, Isaac had held on to faith in Yahweh, the God of his father, the God who saw. He wasn't convinced that any of it was God's fault, what his father had put him through. I mean, yes, perhaps Abraham had been trying to do what he thought God wanted, but that doesn't mean that Abraham was right. Does it? Does it? The story of the binding of Isaac, as it's often called, is one of the most difficult in all the Bible. I mean, however you understand it, it is difficult not to see it reflecting negatively on God. I mean, if God really did want Abraham to literally sacrifice his son on the altar only to change his mind at the last minute, well, that leaves us with an image of a God who not only demands what is unacceptable, but who is changeable and unreliable. The only other option seems to be that God never really intended for Abraham to go through with it at all, that it was only a test. But I fail to see how that is much better. I mean, how could anybody put a father in, how much more, a son, a child through such a test? It's not merely cruel, it is unquestionably immoral. I mean, can you imagine the scars, the lifelong trauma that such an experience would have created? And I realize, of course, that ancient people did not have the same understanding and appreciation of the potential lifelong effects of post-traumatic stress that we as modern people do. But surely you would think God might be able to understand the effects that such a stunt would have on Isaac. So what do we do with this story? I do tend to approach such questions from a bit of a different angle. I assume that the Bible is, above all, a record of the human experience of God. As such, it is a human project, even if the overall process of its creation was inspired. As such, the Bible reflects growing and changing understandings of God over time. And that must necessarily include understandings that were wrong or incomplete and that had to be corrected by new experience. So, were there people, even early Israelite people, who thought that God might want human sacrifice? Yeah, possibly. Were they right? No, of course not. There might well have been ancient Israelites who believed that God wanted to put their people through cruel tests that would leave permanent scars on their children. No doubt there were Israelites who believed that, but they were wrong to believe that. And yes, their subsequent experience showed them they were wrong. The Bible is a valuable record of that journey of discovery. For me, the story of Abraham and Isaac is the story of Abraham discovering what God didn't want, that God didn't want him to behave like he thought God did. Now, because we don't always take the right approach to the Bible, there is a danger, therefore, that persists. What happens when people take stories like this as the end of the journey of discovery, not just a step along the way? What happens, for example, when people discover that their children are expressing themselves in ways that they do not approve of? They might react by binding their child, by forcing their child to conform to their understanding of what God's, suppressing that child's God-given self-understanding in the process. And this is something that continues to happen. Psychologists, counselors are seeing growing numbers of people who grow up in or who spend extended amounts of time in high-control religious environments. And they find that as a result, they will suffer, or many do suffer, long-term post-traumatic stress. I'm talking about the kind of religious environment, Christian or otherwise, where members of the community are under constant surveillance, their speech, thoughts, dress, and appearance liable to be judged, and often found lacking by family, by the church community. And people who live under those kinds of circumstances, they are bound in that they do not have a way to properly express themselves. And that leaves lasting scars on the psyche. Many have had to go through extensive therapy to find healing. And why do people do that? Why do people do that to people they love, to the members of their spiritual communities? Because they're afraid. They're afraid of people who are different. They're afraid of divergence. And they are probably carrying around an image of a very angry God of whom they are extremely afraid. That's why I don't think we should be afraid to say that Abraham was wrong. Abraham was wrong about what he thought God wanted and demanded from him and of his son. At the end of this horrible episode with his son, he knew better. And yeah, sure, it would have been preferable if he had not put himself and his son through such a terrible ordeal to get there. But the truth of the matter is that we human beings, we sometimes have the hardest time learning the most important lessons. High control religion is dangerous. It does potentially cause trauma. And I'm certain that that is not what pleases God. The end of this story in Genesis, we learn that it's a story about a God who sees. That's what the name Yahweh Yireh, Abraham, gives to God. That's what the name means. A God who sees. A God who sees the damage that is done. The God who sees to what we need in order to survive. God sees. The real question for us is, do we see? And if we see, what are we going to do about it? Gracious God, I do pray for all of those who suffer from trauma as a result of the very restrictive religious environments they've experienced. I pray for hope and healing, and help us all to be part of that. Amen.